Getting started again, finishing up or getting closer to finishing up our journey through the book of Acts. We're going to be in chapter 21, verse 37 this morning. Before we get into that, let's begin with a word of prayer. Lord, we thank you for giving us today. We thank you for this chance to gather together and to study your scriptures and just help us to ponder on the truth that you give to us and help us to use it for our lives and just help us to use it as an example for ourselves and to teach to our families and our friends and the people who live around us, and just help us to always be eager to live by your word and to be eager to share it. So, Lord, in that, just help us to not just have an academic understanding of your word, but help it to be a practical part of each and every one of our lives. Lord, we continue to have many sick and many needy of our number, and just please help us to have the kind of heart that notice those kind of needs, and help us to share in the abundance that you give to each and every one of us, and just help us to share of our time, our talent, and our ability to help lift those out of need, whether those be spiritual things or physical things. And Lord, you know all of these needs, and just please also bless those who you know have these kinds of needs. Lord, please also continue to watch over our spiritual leaders and just help them to continue to be good shepherds of your flock, and just help them to lead by example and to lead in a way that it's in accordance with your will. It's in Christ's name that we pray. Amen. All right, so we are in Acts 21. And so despite all of the warnings that Paul has received, he has made it back to Jerusalem. And so he has weathered all of that. And I'm sure it must have been somewhat tempting to not, go back. But Paul did it because he knew that was what God's will was. He meets with James and the elders of the Jerusalem church, and they apprise him of the situation, and they fill him in on what's going on. That there are many Jewish Christians, but those Jewish Christians in the area are very zealous for the law. And these people who are zealous for the law believe that Paul wants people to forsake the law. Paul wants them to basically apostatize from the law. And it couldn't be further from the truth. Gentile people are not bound by the law of Moses, but yet Paul is not actively trying to work against and destroy the law of Moses. And so it's a lot of people just getting worked up over something that isn't even true. And so to dispel all of this, these elders and James, they tell Paul to join several other people who are completing this vow, sort of like a Nazirite vow. And so they cleanse themselves in the temple as part of that. And it kind of makes sense that he would do that, because to dispel that rumor that he's against the law, that he is going to do something that is of the law. And so his actions are going to speak louder than any words could, hopefully, and that it would kind of prove that Paul is someone who still has a high regard for the law of Moses. But the whole thing kind of backfires on them, This wisdom that they're using, it doesn't really take into account the unreasonableness of the people of the area. And it just kind of, the situation just deteriorates, because as Paul is completing that vow, some Jews from Asia then accuse him of bringing a Gentile into the temple, and they drag Paul out, and it's dramatic. And of course, there's no Gentile to drag out, because Paul didn't bring a Gentile into the temple. And this just, stirs the whole city into an uproar, and Roman troops have to literally carry Paul out from the crowd, that the people are pressing in so much, just trying to get at Paul, that they can't just drag him out, but they have to kind of lift him up and kind of carry him just to get him out. And then they take Paul to the barracks, what Luke refers to as the barracks, which is the adjoining fortress, Roman fortress of Antonia. And as we had previously shown, it has these towers, and they could kind of look into the temple complex and to kind of see what's going on. And so we finished up last week. So the Roman tribune in the city, which would be the highest ranking Roman officer there, he is talking to Paul at this point. And so that leads us into verse 37. So Paul's kind of being carried into these barracks, and he's not quite in those barracks just yet, and this exchange occurs. So verse 37, as Paul was about to be brought into the barracks, he said to the tribune, may I say something to you, or may I be permitted to speak, another way of saying it. And he said, do you know Greek? And so Paul would have, spoken Greek to this man, Paul, a Jew. So he just, communicated in Greek to this Roman soldier, Greek being the main language in that part of the world. Many Roman people would have spoken Greek because they would have needed to know Greek to converse with the people in this section of the world. And so, do you know Greek? And so he's surprised that this Hebrew person would know that. Verse 38, now he kind of jumps to a conclusion. Are you not the Egyptian, this mysterious Egyptian, then who recently stirred up a revolt and led 4,000 men of the assassins out into the wilderness? So this Egyptian is someone who had an insurrection against the Roman government and led 4,000 men, according to this tribune, out into the wilderness. And what's interesting is that this situation is actually recorded by Josephus. And so Josephus was a general, a Jewish general, and he fought against the Romans during the Great Jewish Revolt. And he was captured and he surrendered. And the Roman general that captured him eventually became the emperor of the Roman Empire, a guy named Vespasian. And they kind of became friends, believe it or not. And he allowed Josephus to write a history of the Jewish people and to write a history of the Jewish war. And I say all of this because a lot of times in this era, you have to take a lot of history with a grain of salt. The people are interjecting their opinion a lot into the things that they wrote. But Josephus is a man. If he was a general about 10 years after these events that are unfolding in Acts, Josephus was alive. Josephus was around this part of the world when all of this stuff was happening. He would have personally known of all of this stuff. And so Josephus writes of this situation here. And so this is in Antiquities, the history of the Jews. These works that were done by the robbers filled the city with all sorts of impiety. And so there were these robbers, assassins in Acts. What that word assassin is, a Sicarios. It means like dagger man. That's going to come out a little bit later. And now these imposters and deceivers persuaded the multitude to follow them into the wilderness. Kind of sounds familiar, doesn't it? And pretend that they would exhibit manifest wonders and signs that should be performed by the providence of God. So sort of a false prophet. And many that were prevailed on them suffered punishment of their folly. For Felix, we're going to see him later. So we know that this is around this time that all of this stuff is happening. So that's the Roman governor at this time in Judea. Brought them back and then punished them. Moreover, there came out of Egypt about this time to Jerusalem one that said he was a prophet, and advised the multitude of common people to go along with him to the Mount of Olives. Now when Felix was informed of these things, he ordered his soldiers to take their weapons and come against them with a great number of horsemen and footmen from Jerusalem, and attacked the Egyptian and the people that were with him. He also slew 400 of them and took 200 alive. But the Egyptian himself escaped out of the fight, but did not appear anymore. And so there is a record by Josephus of this Egyptian, and it's this person who led this band of robbers, and many of them, and they were sort of a scourge on society. They were leading this revolt. And so you have this Roman tribune, Claudius Lysias, his name, and he is looking upon the way that the crowd is treating Paul, and so he assumes, well, they're so worked up, he must be this guy who was the leader of all of these robbers and everything. This must be the horrible, bad, awful thing that Paul must have done. If only he knew what it really was that Paul had done, which was absolutely nothing. And so this is where that tribune is coming from, and thinking that Paul must be this notorious king of robbers, this Egyptian. And so, he's kind of saying that must be the proportionate response here. So that kind of sets the stage. Another thing, though, is that those robbers are a very common thing, and we're going to see a little bit more about that later. And so, there are robbers working in and around Jerusalem, and these people are getting worked up and angry at Paul because they think he brought the wrong guy into the temple. So you can kind of see the level of proportion. And we're going to even see how much more the level of proportion that they got wrong as far as corruption and stuff in the city. So continuing on. Any other thoughts there before I go on? Okay, any questions, anything like that? Okay. So with that said, Paul replies, I'm a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia. We know this. And so a citizen of no obscure city. Tarsus was a very major city. So Paul is saying, I'm not from an obscure place. I am from this, very notorious city. That's probably not a good word, notorious, but it has a city of high repute. It's not unknown. I beg you, permit me to speak to the people. So Paul is going to try to smooth all of this over. And when he had given him permission, Paul standing on the steps, and so they're on the steps kind of trying to get out of that temple court, motioned with his hands to the people. And so he's kind of, going to say, hey, I'm going to speak. And when there was a great hush, he addressed them in the Hebrew language, saying. So Paul is not only going to talk to these people and try to explain the situation, he's going to do so in their own native tongue. He's going to do so in Hebrew, which is a major thing. If Paul is being accused of this person who is trying to subvert Hebrew customs and subvert the law of Moses, it's an important thing that he addresses them in the Hebrew language. Because if he was this person that was trying to shirk all of those things, he would have talked to them in Greek and not in Hebrew. And so Paul is choosing his words very deliberately and very cautiously here. And so Paul is going to tell them about what's happening. So, brothers and fathers, hear the defense that I now make before you. And when they heard that he was addressing them in the Hebrew language, they became even more quiet. And he said, and so this crowd recognizes that Paul is speaking to them in their own native language, and that kind of a hush comes over the crowd. And now Paul is going to relay his story, which we have already read most of all of this before, so we're going to kind of race a little bit through this. So, I am a Jew, born in Tarsus in Cilicia, but brought up in this city, educated at the feet of Gamaliel, according to the strict manner of the law of our fathers. And so evidently, I think it's very likely that the person who educated him is the other Gamaliel that we hear about earlier in Acts. I think it's the same guy, the one who says, hey, we need to leave these Christians alone. If they're with God, we're just going to end up fighting against God. And so a very, rational, respectable individual. Very likely that it's that same Gamaliel. And so again, Paul's kind of starting this account, and if that was important to Paul, that he was raised at the feet of this respected person, that he was raised in the exactness, the strict manner of the law of our fathers. He hasn't shirked any of this. He still respects all of this stuff, and he is pronouncing this on the steps to everybody who's going to hear him. So, being zealous for God, as all of you are this day, I persecuted this way to the death, binding and delivering to prison both men and women. So this is how zealous Paul was for the law. Verse 5, as the high priest and the whole council of elders can bear me witness, because they were the ones who gave him the instructions. From them I received letters to the brothers, and I journeyed toward Damascus to take those also who were there and bring them in bonds to Jerusalem to be punished. So Paul's just proving, I'm a person who's been zealous for the law, and I continue to be zealous for the law. Continuing with that, verse 6, as I was on my way and drew near to Damascus about noon, a great light from heaven suddenly shone around me, and I fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to me, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? We saw those exact things earlier when we saw the account earlier in Acts. Verse 8, and I answered, who are you, Lord? And he said to me, I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting. Now those who were with me saw the light, but did not understand the voice of the one who was speaking to me. So only Paul heard that. And I said, what shall I do, Lord? And the Lord said to me, rise up and go into Damascus, and there you will be told all that is appointed for you to do. And since I could not see because of the brightness of that light, I was led by the hand by those who were with me and came into Damascus. We've seen all of this before, and so Paul's story has not changed. It's the same thing. So Paul is just telling them how he came to be where he was. He didn't get just some wild hair to say, you know what, I don't like the Jewish law anymore. He was actually led by God in order to take this step into Christianity. Continuing on, verse 12. And one Ananias, a devout man according to the law. Again, this person is a devout according to the law. So he's hanging out and being led around and healed by people that are devout to the law, not people who are trying to shirk the law. Spoken by all of the Jews who believed there, came to me and standing by me said to me, Brother Saul, receive your sight. And at that very hour I received my sight and saw him. And he said, the God of our fathers appointed you to know his will, to see the righteous one, and to hear a voice from his mouth. For you will be a witness for him to everyone of what you have seen and heard. And now why do you wait? Rise up and be baptized and wash away your sins, calling on his name. And so again, Paul's recounting what had happened to him. And at no point does Paul ever say, I want to destroy the law of Moses. I want to destroy all of the rituals and all of the traditions that we have. That's not factoring into this story at all. And he's presenting this, again, as a defense. Any observations here? So this is all stuff that we have seen previously. Verse 17. When I had returned to Jerusalem and praying in the temple, I fell into a trance and saw him saying to me, make haste and get out of Jerusalem quickly, because they will not accept your testimony about me. And I said, Lord, they themselves know that in one synagogue after another I imprisoned and beat those who believed in you. And when the blood of Stephen, your witness, was being shed, I myself was standing by and approving and watching over the garments of those who killed him. And he said to me, go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles. And so here we do get a little bit more information than we did previously. Acts 9 only relates, what happens when the brothers found out about this plot to get Saul at the time. And so here we see that, he actually got a warning. We see kind of Saul's side of this. And it's interesting that, Saul even kind of doubts, his mission here a little bit. He says, Lord, they themselves know that one synagogue after another I imprison and beat those. And so he has this doubt that the people that he's going to bring the message to, that they're going to reject him. And he has this doubt that, they're going to recognize him and say, well, Saul, you are this guy who previously persecuted us. We are, not going to trust you. And Paul, kind of wrestled with that a little bit here. Again, that should be an encouragement to us that, if someone like Paul had doubts in his mind, if someone like Paul was a little bit shaken about who he was and whether or not he was fit to deliver the message, we shouldn't be too discouraged when we have those same kind of doubts and challenges. But Paul rose to the challenge, and we should also follow Paul's example. And so it's okay to have fear. It's okay to have doubt, but yet we need to conquer those fears and doubts just like Paul did. And it's interesting, even though Paul had that doubt, and he said, their people are not going to listen to me based upon who I am. We have all of this account from Luke about how Paul faced rejection from city to city to city where he went. And there were people that fought against Paul and people who sought to kill Paul. But at no point, did any of them reject Paul because of who he was. That's never recorded here in Scripture. And so Saul faced rejection, but it wasn't for the reason that he doubted. And so sometimes our doubts never actually come to fruition. Sometimes we never take that first step to doing something because we are afraid of something that's never even going to happen to us. And so it's an important thing for us to conquer those doubts. So a little bit of extra stuff, a little bit of extra insight here. But Paul closes and he says, go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles. I mean, for us, that's like a throwaway line. I mean, we could just go right past that and we're not even going to miss a beat. But for the people that are his audience, that he's speaking to Hebrew in, this is going to be a big deal. These Hebrew people, these Jewish people, they are God's chosen people. And now to bring that message to these Gentiles, oh no. That's sharing it with people that shouldn't be chosen. And we want to be the only chosen one. And so we're going to see how they respond to that line that is, from our perspective, very, very innocuous, anything but for these people. Any further observations, questions here? Yes?
Well, it gives you insight into the hardness of the hearts.
Absolutely. That hardness of their hearts. And, and some of these people would have had to have been Jewish Christians even. And, I think that hardness that they had is that they had the grace of God. They had the love of God. They had the honor of being chosen by God, but they didn't want to share it. And that should be a very stark lesson for us as well, that sometimes we want to take that light that has been given to us and kind of hide it over a basket and hoard it for ourselves and be inward focused on, keeping those doors closed and everyone inside of those doors safe. But we should be eager to share the gospel with as many people as possible. We can't be the kind of people that says, well, the gospel isn't for people that are like this or like that. And we can fall into the trap that those very people did. We may not persecute someone like Paul over that, but we might take actions that reinforce those kinds of ideas. So we've got to be careful. Yes?
You got to remember, too, he had people following him all the time.
Right.
Because they said there was Jews from Asia,
Mm-hmm.
and all they done was went and kept people stirred up.
Right.
Anytime they got a crowd together,
Right.
the crowd may have liked it, but then they would get to walking through the crowd, and it's amazing how stupid some people are.
Yeah.
It doesn't take much for their mind to be changed by someone's opinion.
Right.
They don't even try to follow up and check it out for themselves.
Right. And they were just looking for the next thing to be zealous about. It's like being zealous, but yet not according to godly wisdom, And so they were just looking for something to be offended over. And we can kind of do that too in a way. We're just looking for someone or something to be offended about and throw our weight around rather than thinking about it for a second. We got to be careful. It reminded me of a bit of a quote. I'm trying to get it right here. That a person is smart, but people are stupid. I hate to use the word stupid from up here. But the idea that individually, we think for ourselves and we, suss something out. But yet you get a group of people and they just follow the crowd. Well, that guy over there, he's mad. I guess I should be mad too. And there are situations that kind of go both ways, where a crowd is going to just whip themselves up into a frenzy over nothing. And there are also even situations where a crowd will see someone who is fallen down and hurt and in need, but if the crowd doesn't respond to them, then no one responds to them. And so people don't act and people don't think for themselves. They just think as a crowd. And so our relationship with God is an individual relationship, each and every one of us individually. And we need to think things through, and we need to have a faith that is not based upon just following what everybody else is doing, but actually thinking about it and having a personal faith. So, good observations. Any other comments, questions? Okay. So, moving along, how are these people going to respond? Verse 22, up to this word, they listened to him. So remember, they were hushed, they were quiet. They heard he was speaking in Hebrew. And so talking about how he was not against the law and how he had listened to God. And so they were listening to all of this. Then they raised their voices and said, away with such a fellow from the earth. I don't think that they just wanted to get him out of the region and escort him out of the temple. I think away from the earth is saying, this guy's got to die. We have got to take his life from him. So that was evidently too much. And, before it was about respecting the law. And as soon as it was not about respecting the law, it was now all of a sudden Paul was saying that salvation can come to Gentiles. So it's like they're just finding anything to be upset about. There's no satisfying these people. They were just looking for something to complain and to be bent out of shape and to be zealous over, going from one thing to another thing. It has nothing to do with logic, has nothing to do with reason. So they raise their voice away from the earth, for he should not be allowed to live. And as they were shouting and throwing off their cloaks and flinging dust into the air, you can almost see this, outward show that they wanted to show how upset that they were. And they were just, kicking dust. I'm thinking of like a baseball game where, the people kind of kick up the dust on each other, like on the ump, and then the ump does it back. And then, so they're just trying to show how upset they are. And the tribune ordered him to be brought into the barracks. And so this tribune sees that this situation is deteriorating and they need to get Paul out of it, saying that he should be examined by flogging to find out why they were shouting against him like this. I would very much doubt that the tribune and the people with him understood a word of any of that interaction. So he doesn't know what Paul, remember Paul's speaking in Hebrew. And so he might as well have been speaking, well, I guess Pig Latin, he might have understood Latin, right? But he might as well have been speaking any other language, gibberish or whatever. And so that whole exchange, he doesn't know what did he say to make all of these people mad. He had them eating out of his hand for a second, and now all of a sudden they're upset. What are they upset over? And so they're going to find out the truth by the easiest way to extract the truth. We're going to beat it out of him, basically. We're going to flog this guy, and he's going to tell them, what did he say? He had them going for a second, and now they're mad again. He's whipped these people up into a frenzy. So they're going to flog him. Verse 25, but when they had stretched him out for the whips, and so they're literally, I mean, this isn't like these soldiers are thinking, are you sure, boss? You know, do we really want to beat the truth out of this guy? This was common practice for these people. And so they were already ready to stretch him out and like, all right, let's go. Paul said to the centurion who was standing by, is it lawful for you to flog a man who is a Roman citizen and uncondemned? I mean, there's no uncondemned, there's no trial. He's just accused of something, and they were just trying to get the truth out of him. So this wasn't punitive in nature. They were just trying to extract the truth through beating somebody. You know, think of like a rough interrogation, basically. And so Paul is saying, can you do this to a Roman citizen? Because you could beat the truth out of somebody, but yet not if they were a Roman citizen. And so people who were citizens in Rome, formally, you could be a subject of the Roman Empire, under Roman control, but not enjoy the benefits of citizenship. And so some people within the Roman Empire were actual citizens and had more protection than non-citizens. And so Paul's asking about this. And when the centurion heard this, he went to the tribune and said to him, what are you about to do? For this man's a Roman citizen. And so remember, they're eager to stretch this guy and, beat some truth out of him. But once they found out that he has rights, that they're saying, you sure you want us to do this, boss? And so they find out that he is actually a Roman citizen. And again, I think that kind of gives us an example from a legal standpoint. I think that we can use our standing within a country as Christians to our advantage for the purposes of truth. And we shouldn't be ashamed to do that. Paul did that here. We need to know our rights, and I think that that's important. So the tribune came and said to him, tell me, are you a Roman citizen? And he said, yes. And so Paul establishes that he is a citizen. The tribune answered, I bought this citizenship for a large sum. And so, you could effectively buy your citizenship within the Roman Empire, either by, paying the right person to give you patronage or doing something amazing or, like military service, whatever. There were a lot of ways a person could earn their citizenship. And there were a lot of ways a person could kind of grease the wheels and get themselves citizenship. And so, on the other hand, Paul said, but I am a citizen by birth. And so because Paul was born in Tarsus, a Roman city, in a Roman senatorial province, just by the fact that he was born there, he was born a citizen. And so in a way, Paul is on better social standing on his citizenship than this Roman tribune is. And so he doesn't just kind of have rights, he most definitely, absolutely has rights. Verse 29, so those who were about to examine him withdrew from him immediately. And examine is a very nice term for what they were about to do to him. The people that were about to beat him, all of a sudden they withdraw. It's like, we're not going to have anything to do with this. We don't beat Roman citizens. They withdrew from him immediately, and the tribune also was afraid, for he realized that Paul was a Roman citizen and that he had bound him. And so, they were treating him like one of the rabble, like one of the people that they could freely mistreat. And now they suddenly realize that he has rights. Verse 30, but on the next day, desiring to know the real reason why he was being accused by the Jews, he unbound him and commanded the chief priests and the council to meet. And he brought Paul down and set him before them. And so he still needs to get to the bottom of this, but he's going to use a more diplomatic way of doing it. And so he's going to have Paul on one side, and he's going to have the chief priests and the Sanhedrin on the other side. Now, what I don't think happened, and consider everything that just happened to Paul, the tribune didn't just turn Paul over to the Sanhedrin and take him over to the council room where the Sanhedrin normally meets. That would be like sending him into the snake pit, basically, right? They would have killed him right then and there. And so this meeting is not occurring in where the Sanhedrin typically meets. This is occurring beneath the barracks. And so this is still in that fortress Antonia where the Romans can control the situation. And so they are taking the Sanhedrin and they are coming there to meet. And that's going to be a little bit of an important detail in a second on some of the things why Paul is saying. So if the council isn't meeting in its formal capacity, the people are not going to be dressed in the typical garb that they would, especially the high priest. And since I'm mentioning the high priest, I think it's also important for us to see what kind of guy is this high priest before we jump into this. We get a hint from what's happening in Acts, but this Ananias guy, upstanding individual. Josephus writes about him too. Now think about this again. Josephus is a Jew. He is a Jewish general. So if he doesn't like somebody, he's not writing them out of general disrespect for Jewish people. He's writing this because he feels that this is the truth and this was a true bad person in their society. This is what Josephus says about this wonderful guy, Ananias. And you would think, if you're the high priest, you're going to be the best of the best. You're going to be the cream of the crop of Judaism. And so you're going to be this selfless person. You are going to be, a person who knows the law and lives the law and all of this. Here's Ananias. So now as soon as Albinus was come, now this is a little bit in the future where Josephus is writing here. And so this section of Antiquities is from about 62 AD. So this Albinus that's being written of here, he's the Roman governor who replaced Porcius Festus. And if you remember from Acts, Porcius Festus is the guy who replaced Felix. And so we're several years later. But I don't think that Ananias is going to have this huge change of character within a couple years. And so Albinus came to the city of Jerusalem. He used all his endeavors and care that the country might be kept in peace. So he's trying to clean house because the guys who preceded him really dropped the ball. And this by destroying many of the Sicarii. Remember, those are the dagger men. Those are the assassins that the same word that's translated as assassin that we read about here in Acts. And so all of those robbers, all of those people who were killing folks, he's doing away with that. He's cleaning house. But as for the high priest Ananias, so this is the guy, Ananias ben Nebudias. So Nebudias was his father, because there's a lot of people named Ananias. So this guy, so what kind of guy was he? He increased in glory every day, and this to a great degree, and had obtained the favor and esteem of the citizens in a signal manner. So he had a lot of glory, he had a lot of respect, for he was a great hoarder up of money. And so he kept all of these riches to himself. Oh, but it gets better. He therefore cultivated the friendship of Albinus, so this person who was the Roman governor, and of the high priest by making them presents. He also had servants who were very wicked. So this high priest had servants that were wicked. You're going to love what these servants do. Who joined themselves to the boldest sort of the people. So again, like robbers and henchmen and things like that. And went to the thrashing floors and took away the tithes that belonged to the priests by violence. And did not refrain from beating such as would not give these tithes to them. So the other high priests acted in like manner, as did those his servants, without anyone being able to prohibit them. So that some of the priests that of old were wont to be supported but with those tithes died for want of food. Now let's kind of explain what's going on here. Remember, tribe of Levi, that's where the priesthood is. So these people of Levi were, taking care of the temple. And within that, you had the people who were descendants of Aaron, who were priests, right? And so because those people were concerned about with the work of keeping up the temple, keeping up the worship, and keeping up the priesthood, they didn't necessarily work their own normal jobs and have the way to support themselves. And so what God's plan was, as we all know, is that you set up the tithe. And so everyone from all of the other tribes, they gave of their money so that those people could be supported. Now we've got a guy like Ananias. He was already rich. So did he need to be supported? Did he have enough to get by on? Did he have enough to put food on his table? He absolutely did. But yet he said to himself, I don't have enough. And so he went to the threshing floor. As soon as the wheat was harvested, there was a tithe of that wheat that had to be turned over so it could be given to the tribe of Levi so that they could take that wheat and eat it as food. And so Ananias wanted to make sure that he got his cut before anybody else did. So he, already being rich, sent his henchmen there and beat the tithe out of the people who were harvesting that grain, who were threshing that grain. And then the other priests who also needed it, who also had some means, were saying, well, I guess we've got to do the same thing. We've got to send our henchmen there. And so we've got to make sure that we get our cut. And so all of these guys were sending their henchmen to the threshing floor to collect the tithes. And they were already wealthy. They didn't really need it. But yet the priests that actually need it, the ones who didn't afford to have any henchmen, they didn't get anything because there was nothing left over. And some of those people died of starvation because there was no food from that tithe that was left. These are great, upstanding, righteous God's people, right? Well, this is the kind of person who is in judgment over Paul here and testifying against Paul and saying, well, Paul, you're profaning the law. This guy who was allowing priests to starve to death out of his greed, not that he needed this food for himself, he wanted to hoard up more riches. And he's telling Paul that he is this despicable, horrible person. What a sad, sad, sad state of affairs, isn't it? And so he doesn't really care about righteousness. He just cares about keeping the status quo, keeping the popularity among the people, and keeping those dollars continuing to go into his pocket. That's all this Ananias cares about. So, how does this relationship happen? What happens here with everyone here? Before we get into that, comments, questions, observations? Okay. So, verse 1, chapter 23, and looking intently at the council, Paul said, brothers, I have lived my life before God in all conscience up to this day. And the high priest Ananias commanded those who stood by him to strike him on the mouth. Now remember, we've got henchmen for Ananias, and he's sending people that can, beat the people that are threshing the wheat to get there. So I can kind of see that he probably has some of those sympathetic people here. And he says, strike this guy on the mouth. I don't know that that actually happened, that they might have started to do it and because they're there with the Romans and such, but he's commanded to strike Paul in the mouth. Verse 3, then Paul said to him, God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. Are you sitting to judge me according to the law? And yet contrary to the law, you order me to be struck. And so, this high priest who's acting like basically this crime lord, Paul says, sure, you might try to have me struck, but God is going to strike you. And at the end of the day, that's what really counts. Doesn't matter how much power Ananias has in this life. In the real situation, God, who is truly in control, is going to strike Ananias back. And it may not be now, but it would be, when it counts for eternity. And he calls him a whitewashed wall. I think that kind of harkens back to what Jesus says to the Pharisees, calling them whitewashed tombs. And you can kind of picture what a whitewashed wall, or more fittingly even a whitewashed tomb is that you just have this rough construction that's underneath. They didn't have like the well-hewn 2x4s and stuff that we frame stuff with. They just put random pieces of wood and stone and whatever, and it was just haphazardly made. But then they would kind of plaster over that a beautiful edifice. And so this Ananias had this beautiful edifice on the outside. He presented himself well to the people. He was respected. But underneath, he was just common. Underneath, he was just rotten to the core. And so he had appearance of righteousness, but he didn't actually have righteousness. And so verse 4, those who stood by. So this wicked person, you're setting in judgment to me, but you're not even following the law. And so this high priest was not a righteous guy. Then those who stood by, they're not caring about the righteousness part. Would you revile God's high priest? So he literally just said, the high priest, you're not deciding things in accordance with the law. The thing that they're upset with isn't whether or not they're rightly dividing the law. They're upset that you didn't give this guy the respect that he was due. That's the thing that they were concerned about, which is, again, kind of proof positive that their heart was in the wrong place. So those who stood by, why would you revile God's high priest? And Paul said, I did not know, brothers, that he was the high priest, for it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. And I think this is a way for Paul, and there are a lot of different opinions on what Paul means here. I think Paul is sincere. Remember, they're not meeting in the council, and I think that's an important part, that they're not meeting in the council. So the high priest would not have the garb of the high priest on. And so I don't know that he would have been identified by the way that he wore his clothes as being the high priest. And especially by the behavior that he exhibited, he wouldn't have shown himself to be the high priest. He didn't act like a high priest. And so Paul says, I didn't know that that was you. And so then he cites the law and says, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. And I think he's demonstrating here that he does have respect for the law, even when it's not convenient for him. And so unlike the people that are drawing these accusations against him, he is willing to say that he's wrong. And he's willing to take a step back and say, if I would have known, I wouldn't do that, because I am a respecter of the law. So we should do the same thing even when it isn't convenient of us. We need to be people who stand for righteousness even when it's not convenient. And sometimes that means admitting that we are incorrect. Yes?
I took it as Paul respected the position.
I agree with you, yes. Paul respected the position.
He knew who Ananias was because he met him before.
Right.
It had been years ago, but he did meet him before.
Right.
And he already knew about his reputation.
Mm-hmm.
And he acted more like a mobster than
Yeah.
a priest.
Right.
That's how and they changed things as they tried to mature in the Jewish religion.
Mm-hmm.
And Ananias is a thriving example of what not to do.
Right.
And Paul knew that, and he apologized for disrespecting the position,
Right.
not the individual.
I think that is a great observation, that he apologized because he wanted to respect the position, not the individual. And I think that is an important thing, that Paul did want to follow that law. And, the law says you respect that position. And so Paul didn't make excuses for his behavior. And it would have been easy for him to do so. Well, you're not living up to the behavior, so you're not really the high priest, or whatever. The law states this. The law says you don't, question people like that. You don't revile at people who are in authority. And so he respected the law even when it wasn't convenient for him. Again, a great example for us, because there are a lot of times when we want to make excuses for our behavior. If you are a regular Bible reader this week, if you could raise your hand, I would appreciate it. And so there are a lot of times when we try to maybe make excuses for the things that we do, try to find a loophole in God's law. And that's really a lot of the things that Christ was trying to eliminate by having that law carved on our hearts instead of tablets of stone, that we shouldn't seek those kinds of things. And Paul isn't getting out by some loophole. He's admitting wrong and is trying to stand for righteousness. Should be an example for us. Like we could say, well, we don't need to help the community because who is our neighbor? Who exactly is our neighbor? The people that go to church with us, or people at our exact congregation? Or is our neighbor people who are Christian? Is it Church of Christ? Is it people who are nice? Who is our neighbor? And we try to limit that rather than just doing what God tells us to do. And so I think it sets us, even on minor things, I think it can set us down a path that we don't need to be on. I think that's a good place to stop. I think next week, Lord willing, we will see that Paul is going to even play to some of the weaknesses that these people have and the entrenched sides that they have, because they don't even stand on the same side of things, and they're willing to even give up this fight against Paul when they can score points on their religious rivals. And so Paul plays this divided house, basically. I mean, the Bible says that a divided house can't stand. And you can kind of see with Paul's interaction here that this Sanhedrin, these Pharisees and Sadducees, are a divided house. And they just bicker with one another. And when they see some, blood in the water for their other political and religious rivalries, that they kind of go after that and even leave Paul alone. It's a very, very, very sad state of affairs. And also, Lord willing, we'll even see how bad the Roman government was on this side, because Josephus isn't silent about that as well. And so Paul's going to be turned over to Felix, who is the Roman governor at this point in time, and we'll see exactly how much of an upstanding, amazing individual he was. So thank you for your attention, and thank you for your comments. Lord willing, we will continue next week. We are not going to get finished. What the plan is we will tape some additional episodes of this, and so maybe an hour here and an hour there, and we'll try to finish it online. So if you are curious on how all of this ends, you could tune in to YouTube, so if that's what you want to do. So thank you again for your attention. See you all next week.